Welcome to the Townsmen. We're glad you're here. We're just a couple guys trying to figure out what all's going on and dig into the truth a little bit. So today we're discussing liberalism and conservatism.
Yeah, and right off the bat, we can tell that these two terms are somewhat charged, right? We hear a lot of differing views, warring views even, saying, well, one side is the conservative side, one side is the liberal side. And really what our approach here is as kind of our mission statement states, is to investigate these claims.
Yep.
To really get down at the more presuppositional level of the differences between the two and the philosophy behind these two, what I define more as a worldview, or
Sure.
a matter or a characteristic of a worldview.
Okay.
Here. And so a couple disclaimers. For one, I'm a conservative Christian, right? And so a lot of my perspectives kind of come from that view and that presupposition. And so I want to give justice and fairness to both sides, right? Try to be as honest as possible. And you might even hear in the discussion that I might have a leaning and I might have a bias towards one side. So I just kind of want to put that out there.
Well, I mean, everyone has some sort of lean, and
right.
It's fair for you to express that.
Right. My hope is that, again, as this project states, is we want people of differing views to come onto this, right?
Yep.
We're not here to create an echo chamber where we just listen to ourselves talk and feel good about ourselves, but rather we want to encourage people to speak their mind, what the opinion is, help them with that train of thought to come to a conclusion. And really examine that claim. And so the overarching question when it comes to these two philosophies, the liberal philosophy and the conservative philosophy, the overarching question is, what is truth? And before you even start hearing us talk about this subject, what I really would encourage anyone who is listening is to pause, ask that question, and answer it themselves. What is truth? Right? Before you start getting all these different inputs on what we have to say about this, I want you to examine that claim for yourself. Because, again, as this is a matter of worldview and truth, it's the source and the understanding of truth. I will also say this as well. A big inspiration that I have from this is from Gersham Machen. It's a kind of a weird name, but he wrote a book in 1923. I know it's crazy that we're recording this on the last day of 2023, but 100 years ago. He's a Presbyterian minister. He wrote about Christianity and liberalism. And what his claim is that, and this is coming from Christianity, I'll say, but this can apply in different areas as well, different religions, different systems and whatnot, where he said when it comes to liberalism within Christianity, it's not that it's a different denomination, but he says all in all, it's an entirely different religion. And that's kind of what inspired for me to kind of think a little bit deeper on that claim.
Sure.
Because we grew up in a very, I don't want to say pluralistic, but just more of a society where there's a lot of the presuppositions that our culture and our society would have held on to as like, this is just truth, to where now we don't even really know, again, the overarching, what is truth? We don't even really know what it is. We don't really examine these things. And so, of course, in good fashion, as what we like to do, to be articulate and be careful, is define the two terms. When we even did this a couple minutes ago, right, or we looked up the definition in the dictionary, it's a pretty laundry list on both sides, talking about what it is. What I'll tell you is this is my definition. I know this might sound crazy and it might like, oh, you're being whatever in this. This is how I've kind of define these to help frame my train of thought on this. I'm open to discussion. I'm open to sharpening the definition, and really in the dictionary, although there is a laundry list, I think it is helpful in what they're defined. But these are somewhat ambiguous terms. But I do think these are the words that we use to help define it, or to help describe kind of one's position or the other. And so I'll start with conservatism, and the definition that I like to use, it's the belief that truth is objective and transcendent. It's outside of oneself. And that the goal of the conservative right? Those who adhere and follow this philosophy is to live a life in conformity to this truth, to understand it and to conform themselves to that reality.
Yep.
It's more along the lines of, I'm not denying that they have subjectivity, that you have feelings that you believe, but there is a standard that's outside of you generally that you're trying to conform it to, and you really want to live harmoniously with that.
Okay.
Where liberalism as a philosophy, you find it in the word, to liberate.
Yep.
Which, this is pulling from Gersham Machen. He said that word liberate is not a bad thing, right? In World War II, the Allied forces liberated Europe from Nazi rule. Our country liberated, if you will, the slaves from the institution of slavery. You hear that all the time. And again, in Christianity, what did Jesus do? He liberated us from sin and death, you know, in his atoning sacrifice. And so that word in of itself is not inherently wrong or flawed. But when it comes to liberalism as a philosophy, how I see it is, it's the belief that truth is subjective and ultimately determined by the individual. If this sounds like postmodernism, that's exactly what it is. You are the source of your own truth, right? And that the goal of the liberal, those who adhere to this philosophy, is to liberate themselves from what they deem as any form of oppression or restraint. You know, it's that idea of like, well, why would there only be this one set of rules, this one thing? I don't want to have anything to restrain me from this.
Yeah, it's a dialectical practice, basically, as far as liberalism is concerned. It requires an opposite.
Yes.
So if there is an oppressor, there has to be an oppressed. If you feel oppressed, then something must be oppressing you. That's the assumption, I think, there. I would say it's inaccurate. There's going to be problems with it.
Yeah. What it seems like is in the liberal philosophy, it's more of, well, I want reality to conform to me.
Yep.
Which I am the truth. I am the source. And that's really the defining conflict that I see. Whatever that ultimate source of truth is, thus saith the Lord, or thus saith me. And that's where I really can see the difficulty between the warring characteristics of these two philosophies, right? And we see this all the time. Where, let's say on the conservative side, right? Let's say, well, here's what the data, here's what it says, this is what this truth says. For on the liberal side, it's, well, quite frankly, I may not care about the data. Or I only care about the data that speaks to what conforms to me. And so that is kind of the difficulty to where when it comes to talking about issues a lot, and we see this, right? There can be this talking over one another.
Yep.
Right. And I think what this talking over one another comes from is, well, we haven't really established some presuppositions or it's just some baseline groundwork to where we can have a conversation on the issue. And also not throwing out the baby with the bathwater with liberalism. Again, like kind of what we talked about is, if somebody's thinking outside of the box, it's not inherently wrong. We just want to encourage them to examine the claim just like the rest of us. Let me kind of explain some what I would consider false definitions of conservative and some false definitions of liberal as well. So one that I hear a lot of, and I consider a false definition of conservative, is they're really just kind of the liberal of X years ago. You know, hot button topic, right? Gay marriage.
Yep.
Nowadays, like, well, yeah, that's just a thing you can't get, you know, that's just it. 10 years ago, 20 years ago now probably, it's like, well, no, like there's no such thing as that. But now it's like, well, yeah, I'm conservative, you know, I believe in what, yada, 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 but, you know, gay marriage, that's just a fact of life. It's like really what it is it's the liberal philosophy of 10 years ago. And that's kind of shifting the goalposts, really, where it's like you're just kind of behind the game. And for all intents and purposes, can be reactionary as well, which that is another major false definition that I think you and I both really see. I call this antithesis syndrome or reactionary.
Yeah, where your only position is one of opposition to whatever your claimed enemy is.
Right, exactly. You know, oh, that person's a liberal, therefore whatever they say, I'm just going to be the opposite. Listen, if someone who identifies as the liberal says 2 + 2 = 4, guess what? 2 + 2 = 4. Again, you examine the claim.
Yep.
That is one of the fallacies that we see a lot.
Yeah.
Instead of examining the claim, you attack the character.
Yep, ad hominem.
Ad hominem, right? All the time, right? I wouldn't really attack the character, because if you're making a claim, there's a thing called the burden of proof. So if I make a claim, I now have the burden to prove that claim.
Yep.
Where really what we like to do all the time is throw out all these claims. I say we, and this is just
people.
I mean, I do it too, sometimes to my detriment. You make a claim, then someone who's willing to actually question you and challenge you on it.
Yep.
Do you actually have proof to that claim? And that's what I kind of see with the difference with the philosophies, right? In the liberal philosophy, they'll make a lot of claims. You start challenging on it, they'll shift the standard or the goalpost, or they'll get that. And with the conservative, they'll do the same thing. And so that is kind of the false definition that I see a lot of.
Yeah.
I'm just anti-liberal.
Well, I think if you dig down into that false definition, you get what our modern American politics are.
Yeah.
It's the conservatives or the Republicans against the liberals or the Democrats.
Yep.
It's like when you dig down into it, they're not different. They're operating under the same postmodernist kind of lens of the world. And it's because it's all just identity politics. Truth doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah.
And I think at least this is how I think about it. And it seems that a lot of people I talk to also think this way, that if you stand on either side, it's because of the talking points. I personally am more conservative in nature, but I have nothing to do and really no interest in the Conservative Party.
Right.
Because I don't think that's what they are. Like you said, the conservatives nowadays, and this, again, to be clear, this is one of the misconceptions of the two, is that a conservative of now is just a liberal from 10 or so years ago. Do I think that's true? Ultimately, no. But do I think that is true now, and it's also a false definition of it? Yes. But we've been working off of that false definition on a political and worldwide scale that's kind of what it's devolved into.
Yeah.
So they've both, as parties, as philosophies, been bastardized so much that they've both lost touch with where they started.
Right. Yeah. No, and I agree with that. It's just, it's what you're seeing. And that's where it gets kind of frustrating for the average American, for those who have to go to the polls. And just the quick caveat I say to that, for me, my view has always been you just vote for the lesser of two evils. That's just how it is when it comes to politics.
Unfortunately, that's where we're at.
Right.
There isn't a good, there's just a slightly less bad.
Right. Now, are there still...
Wow, that's a terrible position to be in.
Yeah. But I think what our founding fathers, which were pretty smart with, is they have put limitations and systems in place to where it is very difficult to have a majority rule of one particular philosophy or the other, right? That's what I find kind of humorous about, our presidential elections and debates and whatnot, of people complaining that, oh, I didn't vote for this president, this isn't my president, I don't like this president. And you go, you understand he's not your dictator, right? Like we don't have to go to war and overthrow his throne.
Right.
You wait 4 years, you vote for the other guy. If he has a second term, fine, you wait 8 years, and you know for certain he's not going to get in because he can't. It's like that's what's great about what our founding fathers, which again, that was added later on. Yeah. But of that is, again, what we saw politics as, or as what the founding fathers, and I agree with them as, is you can't get around government. It's always going to be there. I think it's a divine institution. It's implemented by God. It's always going to be there. What they were trying to figure out is what is the least amount that is necessary for a functioning society. Yeah, the least amount, and how do we limit its capacity for corruption? Right. Because they knew, both in themselves and in people in general, that power does corrupt. Yep. And if you give them as little of it as you can, and you have very hard set lines of how long they can actually do it, that I think is a fair way to limit such things. Now, do some of those limits need to find their way into other parts of our government? Yes, because there's some people that have been sitting in their chair for, 40 years and they should have been gone after 2, sort of thing. Yeah, the idea of a career politician is befuddling. Yeah. As a service member, right? We're a volunteer force. We're not forced into this. We don't have to do this, all the time. It's a volunteer force. We volunteer our time to do it in hopes that we do a good job, we do what we need to do, and then we go back to just living. And that's really what they wanted. Was you saw politics, or you saw being in government as a volunteering of your time and resources for the betterment of your society, of your state, of your county, whatever you want to, at what level. You do the best you can, and then you go back on living. But now there has been a perversion of that to where for some reason now it is a viable option to sit and to make policies. And I think what happens is every year, dare I say every decade, you're in that seat. I think the more and more detached you become from the society or the community that you're trying to represent. I mean, that's what they wanted to do, was you go volunteer, you come back to normal living. You stay grounded in where you're from and whatnot.
I would dare to say that most of the people that can sit in a position like that spend most of the time in that position trying to keep that position. It has nothing to do with serving the people well, or doing their jobs, or doing any good for, anyone beyond their own chair or family. And I mean, there's something to be said of trying to keep your job. But ideally, you don't go into politics to try to just have a job. And I understand that it's a hard job and you should be paid for it. But I don't think the right way of going about it is just trying to protect that job and just stay in a position of influence.
And to kind of continue on that train of thought as well, what I see is, and this is on both sides, as we're talking the philosophy of liberalism and conservatism, but what I see on both sides is all of a sudden it becomes a popularity contest to where there is an attempt to appeal to the largest swath of people they can to try to get votes so they can keep their position, right? It becomes a popularity contest. And what I like seeing is I've heard of a few, and there are people who do this, but they're more principally driven. And that's where they get their support, is like, I like where you're thinking, I like what you're doing. Where it seems the general trend is, an appeal to the masses. If you kind of hear the difference between the two, right? Trying to be popular versus trying to do what's right or what's principled. Whether you agree with those principles or not, that's up for the voter to decide. Right? There are some politicians, and that's what I like more. Even if I disagree with your principles, I at least like your position in that you're going with, that you're not driven by the populist view and trying to get, the masses on your side. It's more of like, I want to do what's right, or what I think is right. And unfortunately, those people tend to not get as much publicity, probably because they don't want it. And they tend to get driven out as well by someone who is more appealing, if you will.
I've heard it said a lot. Talked with my mom about it, and I've talked with plenty of other people throughout time about it, of when a more independent person comes to the poll or comes to be on the ballot, no one votes for them because they're like, well, not enough people are going to vote for them. It's like, vote your conscience. If that's who you want to vote for them. Don't vote for the person that's, like you said, and I would actually disagree with that to some degree, is voting for the lesser of two evils. It's like, no, vote for what you think is right, even if you don't think they're going to win. Which is, unfortunately, probably still not going to turn out to be a win for the person that you voted for. But I don't know. That's just how my conscience is. I wouldn't want to vote against it.
And
to have to rationalize my vote is not great.
No, and I'm glad you bring that up, because those are really the two kind of competing philosophies, the two competing approaches to it. And I've heard it on both sides. And guess what? You actually also have the right not to vote. If you disagree with everyone, you don't have to vote. It's crazy to think that, right? Funny how there tends to be sides as like, you have to exercise your right to vote. If you don't exercise your right to vote, you're going to lose it and whatnot. I'm like, that's not inherently the case. I respect that position of you vote for who you think is best. Right?
That's the position I have, is I don't vote because I feel like the time and energy that I would need to dedicate just to studying the people who I would be voting for does not seem worth my time. I have other things to work on, study on. You got to go to work. You got other things to deal with. And I've caught criticism of that, of I forget exactly if there's a term for it, but basically like I just want to sit at my grill and do my own thing. It's like, yeah, basically I'm worried about what's in my life, not about the country as a whole necessarily, because it turns out the people in my life and how things are going aren't perfect, and I need to focus energy there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that doesn't mean I shouldn't focus some energy on what's going on a larger scale, and I do. I mean, just personally, I don't feel comfortable voting for any of those people because I just feel like I'm being manipulated, and there's something I won't know until 2 years down the line.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really hard for me to do, and I don't know how to work past that. That's potentially just a downside of our political systems being as they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I respect that. A lot of other guys that think very similarly as well. The two things that I then will kind of bring forth in that view is when it comes to a multiple party system. Let's go with that.
Mm-hmm.
This is just straight statistics, right? Say one party gets 40% of the votes, another party gets 25%, the other party gets 35% of the vote. Well, the party that gets 40% of the votes wins, right?
Yeah.
Right. But if you think about it, then how many people actually didn't vote for that party? 60% of the population didn't actually vote for that.
Yeah.
And so this is where you'd see in more European politics, you'll see that the three-party systems, that's what's kind of the tough part of it. And so even our founding fathers talked about that, about having a two-party system, but you can also have the right to write in or to vote for someone else. And, in the United States, we still have two major parties, but there are all these other smaller parties as well. And that's great.
Yeah.
I want that. And so for me, and I've thought through that as well. There's a part of me that's like, I don't like any of them, don't vote for them, all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
What happens then is I kind of give up my means to chance, not really to chance, but to people who are going to then abuse the system more.
Sure.
And so for me then, I would rather vote for the lesser of two evils, rather than try to wait and hopefully get the best candidate to vote for them. Again, that's the ideal, right? The ideal is to get a solid candidate to do a good job for as long as they want,
as long as they can.
As long as they can, as long as they want. Most of the people that you would want aren't even interested, right? You would be like,
some of the podcasts I've listened to, it's like, man, I wish that guy'd run for president.
Right.
It's like, but they're not interested. They're like, yeah, I don't want that. It's not the responsibility necessarily, but it's like the amount of games you have to play, and they're really not straight games.
Mm-hmm.
It just isn't worth it.
Yeah.
Because the amount of energy it takes is one thing, but the toll that it takes on you and your family and on your own conscience.
Yeah.
I've had some people tell me that I wish people that thought through the things that you do took positions of authority. And it's like, I don't want them. And you start running into the whole philosopher king idea, which never ends well.
No.
The people that you want never do it, and the people that do it are never really people you want.
Yep. Yeah, and again, that's why I like the American system in the sense of, we have means to either vote the right people in or the people that we don't like. There is a time limit to what they can do. However, though, there are, for instance, as a representative or as a senator, you can, have as many terms as you want. That's for a different topic for a different time, but and I agree with you too of you need to focus on where you are. Like focus on where you are right now.
Mm-hmm.
Clean your room, right?
Yep.
Jordan Peterson, clean your room. Focus on the spheres of influence that you have right now. Work on yourself. Get in a better state of where you are, and then that will start expanding outward.
Right.
And that's what's tough is even in the American psyche, we view things in terms of every 4 years.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like every 4 years, where most of the world doesn't really think that way, or they don't really have that view.
Yeah.
I remember there was kind of a cool little side story. Counterintelligence. Really fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like an entirely different world. But one thing that we'll talk about China in particular is China does a thing called deep seeding, because how they view the world is they view things in terms of dynasties.
Yep.
Right? Empires, decades, millennia, all that. And so what they'll do on their adversaries for counterintelligence and for trying, like espionage, all that, they'll send some young kid to college, right?
Yep.
Pay their education, in America, get them. And again, I don't want this to be like a witch hunt or anything. However, the Chinese government does like keeping tabs on those things as opportunities. Maybe what they'll do is that young man or young woman or whatever will marry an American. All of a sudden you start having children who are Chinese American. The Chinese government doesn't forget that. And they have these deep-seating operations, if you will, that takes decades, right? In America, it's every 4 years there's a new president, a new Department of Defense, all of that with different goals and priorities.
Yep.
And that is just a constant recycle and refresh. And you see that all the time. And I mean, just in the American psyche, right? Businesses. They have a CEO, he's there for maybe 1 or 2 years, he gets burned out, we get the next guy, as opposed to these legacies. Not saying right, wrong, or indifferent, that's just how we see it here. And so that's kind of a unique thing to focus on. But get back to the topic at hand. One, I guess, political movement that I find unique and I enjoy talking about, and I'll tie this to conservative and liberal, is the Libertarian. The Libertarian is this really unique movement where it seems like, not just politically, but I would say philosophically to a degree as well, like to try to put their hands on both sides or have their feet on both sides. Just my opinion is I really see Libertarian as just another form of liberalism.
Okay.
But what they're doing is it's not antithesis where whatever the liberal does, I'm just going to do the exact opposite, but really it's more along the lines of their ultimate authority is personal freedom.
Yep.
To where what I think a libertarian view is more of, I don't think they're talking more about personal liberty, but more of autonomy.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, the government can go do whatever bullshit the government does.
Yeah.
Just stay the hell out of my business.
Right.
And in many ways, I get that.
Yeah, and as much as I like the sentiment as well, I think one thing when kind of push someone or a more libertarian view is like, well, do you think there's really any legitimate forms of government? Is there any legitimate responsibilities and purpose of government? And I just have a tough time adhering to a libertarian movement because there's not really much of a fleshing out of that view. Well, what is the government for? Well, all I know is the government shouldn't force me to wear my seatbelt. I can smoke whatever I want, marry whoever I want, right? And you hear that, and it's like, okay, but it's just more of like, you're just telling me what you want. Is there any legitimate forms? Like, what about law enforcement?
Yep.
Is there any law, the justice system and whatnot? And I think someone who adheres to a more conservative view, a lot of the times they have traditions and they have systems in place that they can use as a foundation and a framework, where on the liberal side, it's kind of like a libertarian in the sense of like, yeah, I don't really think what the government should do. Or what I've seen as well, and this is just hearing from other philosophers and whatnot, if the liberal view says this is what we need, an example as we talked about before we hopped on here, the electric car, right? What a conservative philosophy will say is, and this is what I would say a more true conservative philosophy, hey, I like the advancement in technology. I think it's great. You just can't force us to have to drive this one thing. Whereas the more liberal philosophy that we see in today is, no, the electric car is the future. You have to do it. It's better for the environment. It's all this. We need to villainize and demonize, and we need to liberate ourselves from this oppressive, dangerous thing called gasoline. You see this a lot with these two philosophies, right? To where sometimes an aggressive liberalism, right, or an aggressive, dare I say, ignorance sometimes, is they want to impose reality on their, I don't want to say fantasy, but really what they think is their ideal. Right? Everybody drives an electric car while sipping Starbucks lattes and, yada, yada, right? Where, again, that antithesis syndrome sometimes is like, well, screw you, then I'm going to drive the biggest diesel truck I possibly can and only eat meat and all that. It's like, okay, guys, like let's stop fighting. Let's get back to examining the claim, finding what works best, and understanding. And this is where some false definition of liberalism comes in as well, is if somebody thinks outside the box, that is okay. Let them run with that idea, right? Sometimes it is refreshing to hear a different perspective. from someone that you might not give the light of day on a normal day, right? It's okay to give them that time of day and to let them speak their minds, as what we're trying to do here in this project.
Yep.
Speak your mind. Let us walk that out. Let us work through that problem. It can get heated. This is where I think it does take maturity and some restraint at times. But let them work through the problem and let them speak their mind.
Yeah.
I think Jordan Peterson said it, or someone else, where for those who are generally more innovative and trying to think outside the box, someone who generally has a more liberal philosophy, they're usually great at starting and being entrepreneurial. But someone with a conservative philosophy generally does a very good job preserving and maintaining the business.
Yep. If
the ideal is there, there's a correct goal at mind in there. And so that's what, when it comes to these two philosophies, I find unique. Again, I personally tend to lean towards one side, but there are pitfalls. I can sometimes be very legalist, where I focus more on the law and the particular at hand, rather than and lose sight of the focus, or traditional, right? Kind of being stuck in the ways of, how dare, like AI, great thing. Kind of hesitant towards AI. I don't want to banish it, right? I don't want to see it as, it's the sign of the Antichrist, some crazy things that people are saying, right? Let's examine the claim. Let's work through it there. Self-righteousness as well, right? In a conservative philosophy, well, I stand on the side of truth. Everything I do is right and justified. Okay, Pharisee, it's like,
yeah, pretty much,
right? You have to be careful with that. And then also kind of a martyrdom as well. This is what I see for me, as I'm getting towards the latter part of my 20s into my 30s now. As a young man, there's a lot of times where I feel like, man, I got to die on every hill I possibly can, as to prove myself, right? And to fight the cause. But then there gets to be a point where it's like, maybe this isn't worth fighting over. Maybe this isn't. Or, again, the critical, what is important versus what is, discussed, right? I kind of see a three circle of what is to die for, what is to defend, and then what is to discuss and discern.
Yeah, and I look at it as, do I need to not necessarily lose this battle, but do I need to secede from this battle in hopes of winning the war? So like you were saying, you're very fired up on certain topics and you're willing to, throw hands basically because of anything. And I was that way for a while. And I've needed to back up a little bit more, and more like I'm doing right now is letting someone discuss their ideas, walk it out. I can have my agreements or disagreements, and just understand that everyone is on a journey to the truth or to God or whatever exactly you think the end point is. And just understand that whatever I say is not necessarily going to impact that journey. And if it does impact it, oftentimes it was negative with some of the ways I do that before. One of the most dangerous things you can do with the truth is use it as sort of a weapon in conversation. You might not think it's a weapon when you're doing it, but sort of beating someone over the head with it or saying like, hey, you're wrong there, you need to do this, sometimes completely turns them off to ever seeing that or being delayed in ever seeing that.
Yeah.
Now, there's definitely times where it's like, that's obviously wrong. That needs to be brought up.
Yeah.
But if someone's working through an idea, let them work through it. Let them walk it out. And I think one of the greatest graces we can offer people is let them be wrong. If the consequences aren't too severe, it's like raising a kid.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, maybe don't let them dribble a basketball in the freaking street. But it's like, if they want to go ahead with an idea and they're maybe working on a project and they're not doing it the right way, and you see that it's going to end either poorly or not as efficiently as you maybe think it should, let them do it anyways.
Yeah.
It's like, pretty low cost, but I think it takes some time and some practice to understand what the real costs are.
Yeah.
There's definitely moments when it's like, okay, this absolutely needs to be brought up. Someone's going down the wrong path. And like I've seen this with a friend of mine, they're considering leaving their current job. Some time ago, when this friend and I were newer in our friendship, I was very adamant about my opinion, fired up about it, and I stated it, and I stated it often, and I stated it pretty sharply. And I think I damaged that friendship for a while. And relatively recently, I heard back from that friend of, you were right. And I don't really like hearing that, because it's painful to know that your friend suffered the whole time. And it also hurts too that I used to approach things to a way that would push someone away to deal with that on their own, instead of just like, maybe I could just hold my tongue and be their friend during this time, instead of just being right and then letting them figure it out on their own.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a little bit of, like I've said, a little bit of learning that comes along with that kind of thing.
Oh yeah, a lot of it. A few things came to mind. I'll start with the Army's doctrine on defense.
Yeah.
And the reason why I bring this up as a service member and whatnot, the whole purpose of the defense when it comes to Army doctrine is to get back on the offense. So in that frame of reference, there are certain strategies that we do on the defense for the purpose of getting back on the offense. One of them is trading time and space to reconsolidate, to have a more coordinated effort. If you do see that this is an issue that is worth defending and worth dying for, there's sometimes, again, as a pitfall I saw, is this martyrdom of like, well, I'm just going to mindlessly and blindly throw myself into this, right, and die as a martyr, right?
Sure.
If you don't do that in love, if you don't do that in truth,
Yep.
right, it's worthless to a degree. Well, I'm inspiring others to do the same, maybe. But what is more inspiring? Someone who is able to strategically position themselves, right, and honestly give credit where credit is due. If the other position has some good points, commend them on that.
Yeah.
Say, yeah, that does make sense, that I agree with that.
Yep.
However, you're missing the ultimate gain or the ultimate goal in that, right? And that's what I'll see with some hot button issues talking with my mom. When I talk to my mom, as much as I love her, I see that I see some incongruencies in her position, in her beliefs, or her statements, or professions and whatnot. So what I see is what I need to do with my mom, just like what you said. I could either Bible bash, thump over the head, truth and whatnot, or instead of saying you're wrong, saying, well, have you considered?
Right.
Or can I tell you how I view this? Right. And this is kind of what when friends and influence people, of treating someone with dignity and respect. You hope that you be treated the same way, that you give the time to explain your position and whatnot, and hopefully establish some common ground if you can. If not, well, then either you dismiss the conversation, or, sometimes you got to go hard in the paint sometimes. Sometimes you got to do that. Another thing, too, is like the Prodigal Son that you'll hear in the scriptures as well. People love that story, right? Well, what that's a story of is it's a story of repentance. It's a story of, you have two brothers, which both needed to repent, by the way.
Yep.
One was just willing to be honest with it and, live out hedonistic, and then came to the realization, that's a part of repentance, is you come to the realization of your wrongdoing, and you desire to repent, to turn away from that and to return to it. Or the other brother was so inundated with the law, with the tradition, to where when that brother returned, there was no celebration, or he didn't want to celebrate.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate. And that's something, personally, I tend to be more of the older brother type.
Yep.
I'm following the rules all the time, even though definitely not perfect. But I'm following the rules all the time. I'm doing all the right things. So when I see a brother go wayward, it's like, yeah, he deserves whatever he's going to get. And if he comes back, I'm like, how do I know this is true? I'm not going to celebrate. It's like, does it not say to forgive? Does it not say, to do these things? And so that was something, as you were kind of talking, I kind of saw as well.
Yeah, and I think ultimately it's just trying to find something true.
Yeah.
And that's ultimately what we're trying to do. And you're understanding that it's like I was saying, you're on the journey to truth.
Yeah.
And I think liberalism and conservatism are pathways towards it.
Yeah.
But you have to be careful of how you define it.
Yeah. It depends on what you're liberating from and what you're trying to conserve or preserve, too, as well. Again, something I personally want to live by. It's hard to do, but it's like, be willing to question everything.
Yep.
Be willing to question everything and let the truth speak. Not saying to be open-minded to a degree.
Yeah, don't be open enough that your brain falls out.
correct.
Yeah.
But, historically that was actually kind of seen as a kind of a dim-witted thing, actually, of like, oh, you're just going to open yourself up to anything and everything. That's dangerous. There needs to be some discernment and restraint to that degree. But for me, question everything. And once you think you've found it, once you find that claim, work through it, come to a conclusion, test that conclusion, see if it holds water, walk that dog out a bit, see if it withstands, validate the process that you got there as well. Maybe there was something, well, that wasn't quite right. Maybe that was a little off. Maybe we didn't do it in the most effective manner or whatnot. I mean, that's just engineering 101, by the way, is we built you the product. Now let's go back through the processes to make sure it's the most efficient, and then work on it, perfecting the product as well.
Yeah, and at the end, it's what good does it serve?
Yeah.
Because if it's just doing it to do it, there is no serving the good from that.
Yeah. What I don't want is a conservatism that is purely ritualistic.
Right.
And purely traditional in every sense of it's this mundane, mindless actions that you do. It's like there needs to be a liveliness to it. And I think you agree with this, and we have noticed this, or at least you have more, I think, than I have, is someone who may have came from a more liberal philosophy and is now at least willing to examine and explore. That was one thing about a liberal philosophy, where they tend to be more open and hearing different discussions sometimes, and that's great. Or sometimes a conservative might be more cut off.
Yeah.
Let them speak their mind, and it's not just to win them over, but it's to help them with the train of thought.
Yeah.
Again, this isn't, we'll talk about education on a different one, but it's like that classical education was not to teach you what to think, but how to think.
Yeah.
That's great, and that's what we want. And so with this episode was just open up the doors to these two terms that we see all the time, that we hear a lot. I know there are political parties that are associated with both sides, but really we want to examine what are the underlying ideologies and philosophies between the two. And again, this is just our opinion on the matter, but kind of recap, conservatism, there's an objective, transcendent principle or truth, an authority that's outside of me. My goal is to conform to that, where the liberal is, well, there are all these oppressions and restraints. I want to be free from all of those things. I want to be as freely thinking as possible, as freely minded as possible. And unfortunately, sometimes, I want reality to conform to my subjective position.
Yeah, and if I may just shorten that up, it's conservatism is basically I want to conform to reality. Liberalism is I want reality to conform to me.
Yep, that's really it. And if these definitions offend you, I want you to examine, why did they offend you? What is causing that reaction? And help you think through those processes as well. Yeah. Because I don't want to put labels on things, right? Name call, label, and then just dismiss, but rather use terminology that's accurate to help describe these things. And that was the goal, is to open up the conversation. To answer that overarching question. What is truth?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the best things that we have, and it's in our mission statement, is, I mean, it's not from our mission statement, we got it from the Constitution, is the right to free speech. Because I think without liberalism, conservatism can get stagnant. And without conservatism, liberalism can just run off into abstractness and obscurity and into nothing. So having that freedom of speech to talk these ideas out, to walk the dog out, like you've said, is the best thing we know to do. Because we're going to have disagreements, we're going to have different views of the world, but if we're able to talk about them and allow ourselves space to exercise them, and again, like I've said, to extend grace to be wrong, that seems like the best thing we're capable of doing.
Yeah, the one topic you're not willing to discuss, probably the one topic you're going to divide over. So
Absolutely.
Let's continue to have the conversation.
Well, this was the Townsmen. We're glad you were here. We'll see you next time.